Do you believe in the call of the mountain? In the autumn of 1953, I did. And that belief changed everything. The wind carved through Sangre de Cristo Range that October morning, carrying with it the scent of pine and something darker, something wrong. Jacob McAllister stood on the granite ledge, his Winchester rifle resting easy in calloused hands, scanning the valley below with eyes that had learned to read the language of wilderness. At 30 years old, he was a man the mountains had shaped, beard thick and black as coal dust, hair touching his shoulders, muscles built from years of swinging a pickaxe and hauling ore. They called him Bear, and the name fit. Not just for his size, but for the way he moved through the forest. Deliberate, powerful, aware. He had come up here to hunt deer, to fill his smokehouse before winter locked the high country in ice. But the deer were gone, scattered, and then he heard it. A scream. Not the helpless cry of a victim, but something fiercer. The sound of fury, of resistance. The mountain caught the echo and threw it back, multiplying that single voice into a chorus of defiance. Jacob counted without thinking, the way a miner counts support beams in a questionable shaft. 3 men on horseback, 1 woman on foot, fighting. His father's voice came to him then, as clear as if the old man still lived. "Son, when you see wrong being done, silence is also a sin." Jacob didn't hesitate. He moved down the slope with a speed that would have surprised anyone who thought his size meant slowness. Rocks shifted under his boots, but he never stumbled, never slowed. His mind calculated angles, distances, the mathematics of intervention. He didn't like shooting at people. Had done it only once before, in a mining camp dispute that turned deadly. But sometimes a man had to choose between his comfort and someone else's life. The descent took 90 seconds. Long enough to see the woman was Apache. Long enough to see the men wore the dust of hired muscle. Long enough to know this wasn't random. He brought the rifle up smooth and fired twice into the air. The shots cracked across the basin like thunder, sharp and unmistakable. 3 heads jerked toward the sound. The woman, who had been fighting against the grip of 2 men while a third held the horses, stumbled free as surprise loosened their hold. "Let her go," Jacob's voice carried the weight of mountains. "That was into the sky. Next time won't be." The man holding the reins was tall, scarred, with eyes that had seen too much violence and enjoyed most of it. Clay Morrison, Jacob knew him by reputation, Blackwood Mining Company's enforcer, a man who solved problems with fists and bullets. Clay's hand moved toward his sidearm but stopped. The angle was wrong. Jacob had the high ground, the better position, and Morrison was smart enough to know it, for now. "You're making a mistake, mountain man." Clay's voice was gravel and threat. "This isn't your business." "It is now." For a moment the world held its breath. 4 men with guns, 1 woman between them, and the mountain watching it all with ancient patience. Then Clay spat into the dust and jerked his head at his companions. "You'll regret this." They mounted and rode east, back toward Socorro. But Jacob knew men like Morrison. They didn't forget, they didn't forgive, and they always came back. The woman stood alone in the clearing now, brushing dirt from the buckskin dress that marked her as Apache. She didn't cower, didn't weep. Instead, she studied Jacob with eyes that were evaluating a potential threat, deciding whether she had traded one danger for another. She spoke in Apache, words Jacob couldn't understand but whose meaning was clear in her tone. A question, a challenge. "Sorry, I don't speak Apache," he said, lowering his rifle but not quite setting it aside. She switched to English, her accent careful but her words cold. "Why did you help me? What does a white man want?" "Nothing." The word came out harder than he meant. He softened his voice. "Just seemed like the right thing to do." Her eyes narrowed, searching his face for the lie she expected to find. Jacob understood. In 1953 New Mexico, white men who helped Apache women usually had reasons that had nothing to do with righteousness. But he met her gaze steady, and after a long moment, something in her expression shifted. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of possibility. "Your camp nearby?" he asked, gesturing toward the pine forest that climbed the western slope. "I'll walk you back." She considered this, weighing risks against necessities, then nodded once, sharp and decisive. She started walking without waiting to see if he would follow. Jacob fell into step beside her, keeping enough distance to be respectful, close enough to help if Morrison doubled back. They walked in silence for 10 minutes before she stumbled. Her left ankle gave way and she caught herself against a juniper, jaw tight with pain she refused to voice. Jacob saw the swelling above her moccasin. Twisted in the struggle, probably. He moved to a young aspen, pulled his knife, and cut a straight branch as thick as his thumb. Stripped it clean with practiced efficiency. Held it out to her. She looked at the makeshift walking stick, then at him. Took it with a nod that might have been gratitude. The sun climbed higher as they descended into a narrow canyon where water ran clear over smooth stones. Jacob pulled his canteen, drank, offered it to her. She hesitated again, that same calculation behind her eyes, then accepted. The sharing of water meant something in this country, a small covenant. They stopped beneath the shade of an ancient cottonwood, its leaves already turning gold with autumn's touch. The silence between them had changed, still wary but no longer hostile. "Jacob McAllister," he said. "People call me Bear." "Ayanna." She didn't offer her family name, didn't need to. Then, with something that might have been the ghost of humor, "Bear is because you are big and slow?" "Big, yeah. Slow?" He shook his head. "You saw me come down that mountain." "I saw." Now there was definitely amusement in her voice, carefully controlled. "Fast, like Swift Eagle." "That's a better name than mine." "Swift Eagle is my name, in Apache. Ayanna means eternal blossom, but I prefer the other." Jacob smiled, the first real expression of warmth since the confrontation. "Both are good names. Better than Bear, which is what you get when you're large and trip over things." As if summoned by his words, his boot caught on a root hidden beneath dry leaves. He staggered, windmilled his arms, and went down hard on his backside. The landing drove the air from his lungs in an undignified grunt. Ayanna laughed. The sound was startling in its genuineness, a bright thing that seemed surprised to exist. Yes, very slow, very clumsy. Jacob sat in the dirt, looked up at her, and found himself laughing too. Point made. She offered her hand to help him up. Her grip was strong, the hand of someone who worked hard and didn't apologize for it. When he was back on his feet, they stood closer than before, and some wall between them had developed its first crack. They continued on, and now the silence was almost comfortable. The canyon opened into a meadow where smoke rose from cooking fires. An Apache camp, small but well established. 20 lodges, maybe 30. Horses in a rope corral, children's voices carrying on the wind. But as they approached, Ayanna stopped. Her hand came up, signaling caution. Jacob followed her gaze to the ground. Tracks, fresh. 3 horses, coming from the east, waiting. "They were here first," Ayanna said quietly, pointing to where the tracks circled the camp's perimeter before stopping at a blind spot in the rocks. "They knew where I would be. This was planned." Jacob felt something cold settle in his gut. Not a random attack, then. Specific. Targeted. "Why would they want you?" "My grandmother is Red Sky Walker, elder of our people. There is a dispute over land with a mining company, Blackwood Mining. They think taking me will force her to sign away our sacred places." The name hit Jacob like a fist. "Blackwood. Vernon Blackwood? You know him?" "I know what he is." Jacob's voice went flat, hard. 5 years ago he owned a copper mine near Silver City. My father worked there. The shafts had bad air, coal dust everywhere, no ventilation. The company knew. Men were getting sick, coughing up blood. But fixing it cost money. My father died slowly in a hospital bed, his lungs destroyed. Blackwood called it natural causes and moved on to the next mine. Ayanna studied him with new intensity. Then you understand. He does not see people, only obstacles and profits. Yeah, I understand. They entered the camp together, and Jacob felt eyes on him. Suspicion, curiosity, hostility. He was a white man in an Apache camp, and history had given them every reason to be unwelcoming. But Ayanna walked beside him with her head high, and that meant something. An old woman emerged from the largest lodge. She moved slowly, age in every step, but her eyes were sharp and clear. She wore traditional dress adorned with turquoise and silver, and authority radiated from her like heat from a forge. Red Sky Walker, the grandmother, the elder. She looked at Jacob for a long moment, then spoke in Apache. Ayanna translated, her voice careful. My grandmother says the mountain sent you to us. She asks if you are a man who listens when the mountain speaks. Jacob met the old woman's eyes. I try to be, ma'am. Red Sky Walker smiled slightly, said something else. Ayanna's translation came softer now. She says you have good eyes. Sad, but good. You have lost much. It wasn't a question, and Jacob didn't treat it like one. Yes, ma'am, I have. The elder gestured toward her lodge, an invitation. But before they could move, a young Apache man came running from the eastern edge of camp, calling out urgently. He carried something in his hand, a piece of paper. Ayanna took it, read it, and her face went hard as stone. She translated without emotion, but Jacob heard the fury beneath the words. Red Sky Walker, you have 3 days to sign the deed to Sacred Springs and the Northern Hills. If you do not, we will return for your granddaughter, and next time no mountain man will stop us. This is your only warning. Signed, Clay Morrison, representing Blackwood Mining Company. The paper had been nailed to one of the corner posts of the camp, a threat in broad daylight, a promise of violence. Red Sky Walker spoke, and this time her voice carried steel beneath the age. Ayanna translated. The sacred springs are where our people have drawn water for 10 generations, where we pray, where our dead rest. Without it we cannot live here. But Blackwood has papers, false papers we believe, but they say the land is his to mine. The marshal in Socorro takes his money. No one will help us. Jacob felt something shift inside him, a decision forming before he fully understood it. I know someone who might. Marshal Thomas Cole, out of Santa Fe. He's honest, actually gives a damn about the law, not just who pays him, but he'd need proof that Blackwood's papers are fake. Ayanna turned to him sharply. You would help us? Why? You do not know us. I know Blackwood. That's enough. He paused, then added more softly, and I know what it's like to have someone take everything from you because they can, because you don't have the power to stop them. Something passed between them then, an understanding that went beyond words. Two people who had lost things to powerful men who faced no consequences. Two people tired of losing. I will go with you, Ayanna said. It wasn't a request. This is my people's fight. I will not hide while others take risks. Red Sky Walker spoke again, longer this time. When Ayanna translated, her voice was thick with emotion. My grandmother says we must go, that the mountain has brought you together for this purpose. She gives us her blessing and her warning. The path will be hard. Blackwood will not let us reach Santa Fe easily, but we must try. 3 days is not enough time to wait for help to come to us. We must go to help. The old woman stepped forward and placed her hand on Jacob's shoulder, then on Ayanna's. She spoke in Apache, and though Jacob didn't understand the words, he felt their weight. A blessing. A prayer. A grandmother's hope placed in the hands of two people who barely knew each other. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, casting long shadows across the camp, Jacob looked at Ayanna, really looked at her. Not the Apache healer he had rescued, but the woman who would ride beside him into danger, who had already shown courage and intelligence, who had fought 3 men and hadn't broken. "We should leave at dawn," he said. "It's a 2-day ride to Santa Fe if we push it, 3 if we're careful." "We will be careful," Ayanna replied. "But we will also be fast. My people do not have time for us to be slow." As if in answer to her words, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of coming weather. Jacob looked north toward the high peaks of Sangre de Cristo. Storm clouds gathered there, dark and promising. The mountain was speaking again, but he couldn't quite make out what it was saying. He just hoped they would understand in time. That night, as the camp settled into uneasy rest, Jacob lay near the fire they had given him, staring up at stars that seemed close enough to touch. Somewhere in the darkness, Ayanna was also awake. He could feel it, the way you feel the presence of another predator in the forest. Not threatening, just aware, alert. 3 days. They had 3 days to ride to Santa Fe, find Marshall Cole, present evidence they didn't yet have, and somehow stop one of the most powerful men in New Mexico from stealing land that had belonged to the Apache since before there was a New Mexico. The odds were terrible, the dangers obvious. Smart money said they would fail. But Jacob hadn't made it to 30 by being smart. He had made it by being stubborn, by refusing to quit even when quitting made sense. His father had been the same way, had gone into that bad mine shaft one more time, knowing it was dangerous, because the company said it was safe and the family needed money. His father had died for other men's lies. Jacob wasn't about to let Blackwood's lies kill anyone else. Tomorrow they would ride. Tomorrow the real fight would begin. But tonight, under the ancient stars that had watched over this land long before Blackwood or Morrison or even the Apache had arrived, Jacob made a promise to himself and to the mountain that had called him here. He would see this through, whatever it cost. The mountain, if it heard, did not answer. But the wind shifted, carrying new scents from the north. Rain, stone, the smell of a coming storm. And in the darkness, Ayanna Yazzie made her own promises to her own gods, in words her grandmother had taught her. Promises about courage, about justice, about standing firm when the world wanted you to bend. Neither of them knew that Clay Morrison was already riding, gathering more men, preparing for the hunt. Neither of them knew that Blackwood had already sent word to Santa Fe, spinning lies about a dangerous white renegade and a savage Apache woman. Neither of them knew that the path ahead would demand more than courage, more than justice, more than stubborn refusal to quit. But they would learn. They would learn together. And the mountain would watch, patient and eternal, as 2 unlikely allies began a journey that would test everything they believed about right and wrong, about trust and sacrifice, about what one person could do when they decided that enough was enough. The autumn wind blew cold that night in 1953, carrying secrets and warnings to those wise enough to listen. Jacob McAllister, who the mountains had shaped, lay awake and listened. And somewhere in that wind, he thought he heard his father's voice one more time. "When you see wrong, son, silence is also a sin." He would not be silent, not anymore. Dawn came cold to the Apache camp, painting the eastern sky in shades of copper and gold. Jacob was already awake, had been for an hour, checking his rifle and the spare ammunition he carried in a leather pouch his father had made 20 years ago. The brass cartridges caught the early light as he counted them. 30 rounds. He hoped that would be enough, hoped more that he wouldn't need any of them. Ayanna emerged from her grandmother's lodge wearing practical traveling clothes, buckskin pants, and a shirt that would let her ride hard without restriction. Her hair was braided tight, and she carried a bow that looked old and well cared for. A quiver of arrows hung at her hip, alongside a knife that had seen use. A small leather pouch hung from her belt, the kind healers carried for herbs and medicines. Red Sky Walker stood in the entrance, one hand raised in blessing, the other clutching a small leather pouch, which she pressed into Ayanna's palm. Words passed between them in Apache, too quiet for Jacob to hear. Then the old woman turned to him and spoke, and Ayanna translated. She says to trust the mountain and trust each other. That is all we will have when the world turns against us. They rode out as the sun broke free of the horizon, two figures on horseback moving east toward Socorro. The plan was simple enough. Stop in town, gather supplies from Sam Jenkins, who ran the general store, then push north toward Santa Fe. 2 days of hard riding if the weather held, 3 if it didn't. What Jacob didn't tell Ayanna was that he expected trouble in Socorro. Clay Morrison wasn't the type to let things rest overnight. Men like that festered. They plotted, and they always had friends. The ride to town took 4 hours, following game trails that Ayanna knew and Jacob learned to trust. She moved through this country like she was part of it, reading signs in bent grass and disturbed stones that told her what had passed this way and when. Once she held up a hand and they stopped, silent, while a small group of riders crossed their path a quarter-mile ahead. Too far to identify, but the caution was wise. When they were gone, she nodded, and they continued. "You learned tracking from your father?" Jacob asked during a rest stop where they let the horses drink from a narrow stream. "From my husband." Her voice went flat on the word. "He was the best tracker in our people. He could follow a spider across stone, my grandmother used to say." "What happened to him?" Ayanna was quiet for so long Jacob thought she wouldn't answer. Then, "In 1950, 3 years ago, there was a dispute over water rights. White ranchers said we were stealing. We were not. The water was ours by treaty. But treaties mean nothing when the man with the badge is paid by ranchers." She stared into the distance, seeing something Jacob couldn't. "My husband, Running Deer, went to talk with them, to show the treaty, to make peace." Her jaw tightened. "They shot him. Said he reached for a weapon. He carried only papers." Jacob felt something cold settle in his chest. "I'm sorry." "Everyone is sorry. Sorry changes nothing." She turned to look at him directly. "That is why I will fight. Not for revenge. For my husband, being sorry is too late. But for my people who are still alive, maybe fighting is not too late." They mounted again and rode in a silence that felt heavier than before, weighted with old griefs that couldn't be fixed, only carried. Socorro appeared through the heat shimmer of late morning, a collection of adobe and wood buildings clustered along a dusty main street. The town had grown up around silver mining and had the rough edges that came with it. Saloons and supply stores, a church at one end, and a marshal's office at the other. Jacob had been here a dozen times over the past 5 years, knew the layout, knew which alleys led where. "Sam's store is on the north side," he told Ayanna as they approached. "I'll go in, get what we need. You stay with the horses, keep watch." She gave him a look that said she didn't take orders, but nodded. "If there is trouble, I will not run." "Didn't figure you would." They approached from the east, and that's when Jacob saw them. 4 horses tied outside the Dusty Rose Saloon. One of them was a big roan with a white blaze. He'd seen that horse yesterday, carrying Clay Morrison. "They're here," he said quietly. Ayanna had already seen. Her hand moved to her bow. "How do you want to do this?" "Careful. We split up. I go to Sam's through the front. You take the horses around back, wait in the alley behind the store. If shooting starts, you get out of town fast." "And leave you?" "And warn your grandmother that they're already hunting us. One of us has to make it through." She studied him, those dark eyes weighing and measuring. Then she nodded once and turned her horse toward a side street that would take her around the main thoroughfare. Jacob rode straight down the center of the street, not hiding, not skulking. A man with legitimate business in a town where he'd traded for years. But his hand stayed near the Winchester in its saddle scabbard, and his eyes tracked every shadow, every doorway. Sam Jenkins' general store sat between a blacksmith and a boarding house. Jacob dismounted, tied his horse to the rail, and walked inside. The bell above the door chimed, cheerful and innocent. Sam was behind the counter, a stocky man of 60 with more gray than brown in his hair and eyes that had seen too much of human nature to be surprised by any of it. He looked up when Jacob entered, and something flickered across his face. Warning. Jacob, wasn't expecting you today. Need to stock up, heading north for a spell. Sam glanced toward the back room, then back to Jacob, nodded slightly toward the rear of the store. Got some new inventory in the back. Premium stuff. Why don't you come take a look? Jacob understood. He followed Sam through the curtain into the storeroom where barrels of flour and sugar stood alongside coils of rope and stacks of canned goods. But there was someone else there too. A woman, perhaps 45, with kind eyes and worry lines. Maria Henderson, who ran the boarding house next door. Jacob had stayed at her place twice over the past 2 years when business brought him to Socorro. She was one of the few people in town who didn't ask too many questions and didn't judge a man by the dirt on his boots. Jacob. She kept her voice low. Clay Morrison's been here since last night. He's got 4 men with him. They're asking about you and an Apache woman, saying you killed a deputy and kidnapped her. The lie was so brazen it took Jacob a moment to process it. That's not even close to true. Doesn't matter. Sam pulled a cloth off a small pile of supplies he'd already gathered. Dried beef, hardtack, coffee, ammunition. Morrison's got Sheriff Dawson in his pocket. Always has. You show your face on the street, they'll arrest you. Or shoot you trying to arrest you. Either way suits them fine. Maria moved closer. There's more. Morrison sent a man ahead to Santa Fe yesterday, carrying a telegram for someone there. I heard him talking about it in my boarding house. They're setting a trap at both ends. Jacob felt the walls closing in. Smart. Blackwood was playing chess while Jacob had been thinking checkers. Cut off their destination, control the route, and squeeze them in the middle. We need those supplies, Jacob said, and we need to get out of this town. I can help with that. Maria gestured to a door at the back of the storeroom. This connects to my cellar. You can come through, get your horses from the alley without being seen from the street. And Morrison will know I was here the moment Sam's supplies go missing. Sam shrugged. Let him know. I've dealt with harder men than Clay Morrison. Besides, your father traded at my store when you first came to New Mexico. We talked mining and mountains. He was a good man who died for another man's greed. I won't stand by and watch the same happen to his son. Something tightened in Jacob's throat. Thank you, Sam. Thank me by staying alive. Now go. Maria will take you through. They moved quickly, gathering the supplies and following Maria through the connecting door into her cellar, then up through her kitchen and out the back door into the alley where Ayanna waited with the horses. She had her bow strung, an arrow nocked but not drawn. When she saw Jacob, relief flashed across her face before the mask of control returned. Trouble? She asked. Always. He tied the supplies onto his saddle. They've spread lies about us. Said I killed a deputy and kidnapped you. Her eyes went hard. So now, we are outlaws. Now we're inconvenient truths they need to silence. He swung into the saddle. We need to go. Now. But even as he spoke, he heard it. Boots on wood. Voices carrying from the main street. Someone had seen them, or guessed where they'd gone. The back way out, Maria said urgently, pointing west. Through the stable yard, then north along the creek bed. It'll hide your trail for a mile or so. They didn't wait to thank her. Jacob kicked his horse into motion, and Ayanna followed, the animals sensing urgency and responding. Behind them, shouts erupted, the sharp bark of a pistol shot fired into the air. A warning, an alarm. They galloped through the stable yard, scattering chickens and one angry goat, then splashed into the creek bed that ran behind the town. The water was shallow this time of year, barely up to the horses' knees, but the rocky bottom would make tracking harder. They pushed the horses as fast as they dared, water spraying up around them, the town receding behind. After a mile, Ayanna pointed to a break in the creek bank where a game trail led up into the hills. They took it, climbing steep and fast until the creek was just a silver thread below and Socorro was lost behind the curves of the landscape. Only then did they slow, letting the horses blow, checking their back trail. No pursuit yet, but it would come. "They will follow," Ayanna said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah, Morrison's not the quitting type." "Neither am I." They pushed on through the afternoon, angling northwest toward the Sangre de Cristo Range. The mountains rose before them, blue with distance and promise. Somewhere beyond them lay Santa Fe, and Marshal Thomas Cole, and maybe, if they were lucky, justice. But luck seemed in short supply. They made camp that evening in a shallow canyon where a spring provided water and a rock overhang would hide their fire. Small game was plentiful here. Jacob shot a rabbit with his rifle, and Ayanna cleaned it with efficient movements while he gathered wood. They worked in a comfortable silence that came from shared purpose. The meat roasted over low flames while the sky turned from blue to purple to black. Stars emerged, sharp and cold. Ayanna sat across the fire from Jacob, her face lit in flickering gold. "Sam Jenkins," she said after a while. "He helped us knowing it would cost him. He's a good man. There are not many good men." "No," Jacob agreed. "There are not." She watched the fire, her expression distant. "When Running Deer died, I thought all white men were evil, that none could be trusted. My grandmother told me I was wrong, that evil exists in all colors, and so does good. I did not want to believe her. And now? Now I think maybe she was right about some things." She looked up at him. "You did not have to help me yesterday. You did not have to risk yourself today. Why do you do this?" Jacob took his time answering, wanting to get it right. 5 years ago, I watched my father die. Not quickly, slowly. In a hospital bed in Silver City, his lungs destroyed by coal dust and bad air and unsafe mines. The company knew the shafts were dangerous. They knew men were getting sick. But fixing it would cost money, and dead miners were cheaper than safe mines. He poked the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward. My father spent his whole life playing by the rules, working hard, trusting that if he did right, right would be done to him. He died coughing up blood, with nothing to show for 40 years of work but a grave and a debt I'm still paying off. So you fight because you could not fight for him. I fight because silence is what lets men like Blackwood win. Because every time a good person sees evil and does nothing, evil gets stronger." He met her eyes across the flames. "I'm tired of seeing evil get stronger." Ayanna was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Running Deer would have liked you. He also believed that silence was a sin. He sounds like a good man." "He was." Her voice softened. "But he is gone, and I am still here, and I have learned that being good is not enough. You must also be strong, must also be willing to fight." "You're strong," Jacob said. "Saw that yesterday." Something flickered in her expression, not quite a smile, but close. "You are not so bad yourself, for a man who trips over his own feet." Despite everything, despite the danger and the pursuit and the odds stacked against them, Jacob laughed, and after a moment, so did Ayanna. The sound was strange in the darkness, almost defiant, a declaration that they were still human, still capable of finding light in shadow. They ate the rabbit and divided the watch. Jacob took first shift, sitting with his rifle while Ayanna slept wrapped in her blanket. The night was cold but clear, the kind of cold that made sounds carry for miles. He listened to the wilderness around them, the whisper of wind through pine, the distant cry of a hunting owl, the small sounds of a world that continued regardless of human trouble. Around midnight, Ayanna stirred and sat up. "Your turn to sleep." "Not tired yet." She moved to sit beside him, close enough that he could feel warmth radiating from her. "You need rest. Tomorrow will be hard." "Every day's hard. I'm used to it." "Jacob." She used his name for the first time since they'd met, and it sounded different in her accent, softer somehow. "You cannot protect everyone by never sleeping." He knew she was right, but something in him resisted. "If Morrison catches us, it'll be at night, when we're vulnerable. Then we will be vulnerable together, one watching, one resting. That is how it works when you trust someone." Trust. The word hung in the air between them. Jacob realized that he did trust her. Not because he'd known her long, but because she'd proven herself in ways that mattered. Her courage, her competence, her refusal to give up. "All right," he said. "Wake me in 3 hours." "I will." He lay down on his bedroll, the rifle within easy reach, and closed his eyes. Sleep came faster than expected, pulling him down into darkness. The last thing he was aware of was Ayanna's silhouette against the stars, watchful and alert. He woke to her hand on his shoulder, gentle but firm. The sky was still dark but beginning to gray at the edges. Dawn was coming. "Nothing moved," she reported. "But we should go now. Put more distance between us and them." They broke camp quickly, eating cold leftover rabbit and drinking from the spring. As they saddled the horses, Jacob noticed Ayanna moving stiffly, favoring her left side. "You hurt?" "Bruised. From yesterday." She saw his concern and shook her head. "I am fine. I have had worse." "Let me see." She hesitated, then lifted her shirt to reveal a massive bruise spreading across her ribs, purple and angry. Jacob's jaw tightened. Morrison's men had done that when they grabbed her. "Ayanna, that needs attention. Might be cracked." "It is not cracked. I would know. And we do not have time." She lowered her shirt. "I will tell you if it gets worse." There was no point arguing. They mounted and rode out as the sun breached the horizon, painting the world in shades of fire. The day's ride was harder than the first. The terrain grew rougher as they climbed toward the mountain passes, and twice they had to backtrack when trails proved impassable. But Ayanna's knowledge of the country saved them hours. She knew shortcuts, hidden paths, places where water could be found. By late afternoon they had crossed into the foothills of the Sangre de Cristo Range proper. The air was thinner here, colder. Patches of old snow clung to northern slopes where the sun never reached. The horses labored, breath steaming in the crisp air. They stopped to rest at a high meadow where the view stretched for miles. Jacob studied their back trail, looking for dust or movement. Nothing. But that didn't mean they weren't being followed. Just meant Morrison was being careful. "How much further to Santa Fe?" Ayanna asked. "Day and a half? Maybe more if the weather turns." She looked at the clouds gathering over the high peaks. "It will turn." "How do you know?" "The mountain tells me." She said it matter-of-factly, as if mountains spoke to everyone. "Storm coming tonight. Big one." Jacob had learned to trust her instincts. If she said a storm was coming, they needed to find shelter. "There's an old church, abandoned, about 3 miles north of here. If we can make it before dark, we'll have a roof." They pushed on, racing the dying light. The church appeared just as the sun touched the western peaks, a small adobe structure with a wooden cross tilted at an angle on the roof. The door hung open, creaking in the wind that had begun to pick up. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old wood. Benches stood in crooked rows, and a wooden altar leaned against the far wall, but it was dry and would provide shelter from the coming storm. They brought the horses inside, into what had once been a small side chapel, tied them secure, and laid out their gear. Jacob was checking his rifle when Ayanna called out softly, "Jacob, look at this." She stood at the altar, holding something, a small wooden cross, intricately carved, and behind it, hidden in a hollow space in the wall, papers. Jacob moved closer, unfolded them carefully. His heart began to race as he read. Land deeds, transfer documents, all bearing Vernon Blackwood's name, and all with signatures that looked wrong, the ink too fresh, the handwriting too similar across different supposed signers. "This is it," he breathed. "This is the proof we need. Someone hid these here. Someone who knew Blackwood was lying. But who? Ayanna asked. Before Jacob could answer, they heard it. The unmistakable sound of horses outside. Multiple horses. And voices. They had been found. Jacob's hand went to his rifle in one fluid motion, but Ayanna caught his wrist. She shook her head, pressed a finger to her lips, and pointed to the side chapel where their horses waited. They moved silently, pressing themselves against the wall where shadows pooled deepest. Through the gap in the doorway, Jacob could see riders dismounting. 4 of them. No, 5. Clay Morrison's voice carried through the evening air, sharp and commanding. Check inside. They were here. Tracks are fresh. But then another voice, younger, uncertain. Clay, maybe we should wait for the others. If they're armed, they're 1 miner and a squaw. We're 5. Do the math, Cooper. Cooper. Jacob's mind raced. That name meant something. Then he remembered. Deputy Frank Cooper, the young lawman from Socorro. Sam had mentioned him once, said the kid had a conscience which made him rare in Sheriff Dawson's outfit. Footsteps approached the church door. Jacob raised his rifle slowly, knowing that if shooting started in this confined space, people would die. Maybe all of them. Beside him, Ayanna had an arrow nocked, her breathing controlled and steady. The door swung wider. A figure stepped through, silhouetted against the dying light. Young, as Jacob expected. But instead of drawing his gun, Deputy Cooper held up both hands, empty and open. Don't shoot, he said quietly. Please, I'm not here to arrest you. Then why are you here? Jacob kept his rifle steady. Because I'm the one who hid those papers you're holding. Cooper took another step inside, moving slowly. I'm the one who copied Blackwood's documents 6 months ago when I saw Sheriff Dawson filing them. Right after I watched Blackwood's men burn out a Mexican family and did nothing to stop it. Something didn't sit right. The signatures looked wrong. So I made copies and hid them here in case I ever got the courage to do something about it. And now? Ayanna's voice was cold. Now you ride with Morrison? Now I'm trying to keep you alive long enough to use those papers. Cooper's face was tight with stress. Morrison doesn't know I'm talking to you. He thinks I'm checking the church, but he's got men circling around back. You've got maybe 2 minutes before they surround this place. Jacob's mind calculated angles, options, odds. Why should we trust you? Because if I wanted you dead, I'd have come in shooting. Cooper's voice gained urgency. And because I'm the one who's going to cover your escape, there's a ravine 50 yards north, runs down to a creek bed. If you go now while they're still positioning, you can make it. You'll be killed, Ayanna said. Maybe. But I'm done watching good people suffer because I was too scared to act. Cooper pulled his gun and held it out, grip first. There's a tunnel. Under the altar. Used to be part of the old mission system. Opens up in the ravine I mentioned. Your horses won't fit, but you will. Jacob looked at Ayanna. She met his eyes, and in that moment of silent communication, they reached agreement. Sometimes you had to trust or die trying. They moved fast. Jacob grabbed the papers, stuffing them inside his shirt. Ayanna gathered their essential supplies, water and ammunition, and dried meat. Everything else they left, including the horses. Cooper was already at the altar, shoving it aside to reveal a dark opening in the floor. Go, he said. I'll give you as much time as I can. Jacob paused at the entrance to the tunnel. Cooper, what changed? Why risk this? The young deputy's face hardened with old pain. Because 6 months ago, Blackwood's men burned out a Mexican family who wouldn't sell their land. The father died in the fire. I watched it happen and did nothing because I was afraid. I'm tired of being afraid. There was nothing more to say to that. Jacob dropped into the tunnel, landing in darkness that smelled of earth and age. Ayanna followed a moment later, landing lightly beside him. Above them, Cooper slid the altar back into place. They moved through blackness, hands on damp stone walls, feet shuffling carefully across uneven ground. Jacob counted paces, building a mental map. After 60 steps, he saw light ahead. Faint, but growing. The tunnel opened into the ravine Cooper had described, hidden behind a screen of scrub oak. They emerged into twilight. Behind them, from the church, came shouting. Then a gunshot. 2 more. Jacob's stomach clenched, but there was no time to look back. They ran. The ravine was steep and treacherous, filled with loose rock that shifted under their boots. Ayanna moved like a deer, sure-footed even in poor light. Jacob followed, trusting her lead. Behind them, the shooting intensified, a fusillade of fire that spoke of multiple guns. Then silence, heavy and ominous. They reached the creek bed as full darkness fell. Ayanna pulled Jacob into a hollow beneath an overhanging bank, and they pressed themselves into the space, breathing hard. Above, on the rim of the ravine, lights appeared. Torches. Men spreading out to search. "We can't outrun them in the dark," Ayanna whispered. "Not without horses." "No, but we can hide until they pass, then circle back." "To where?" "The church, to get our horses. They won't expect us to double back." It was a desperate plan, but desperation was all they had. They waited in the hollow as searchers passed overhead, voices calling back and forth. Morrison's voice, angry and demanding. Other voices Jacob didn't recognize. But not Cooper's voice. The deputy's silence was its own kind of testimony. After an hour, the searchers moved north, following the ravine away from the church. Jacob and Ayanna emerged from hiding and began the careful climb back up to higher ground. The storm Ayanna had predicted was building now, wind picking up and lightning flickering in distant clouds. They approached the church from the east, moving slowly and staying low. The building was dark. 2 horses stood tied outside, their riders presumably still searching the area. But their own horses were still inside, visible through the open door. "I'll get them," Jacob said. "You cover the approach." Ayanna nodded, bow ready. Jacob moved to the church entrance, every sense alert. The interior was black as pitch. He felt his way toward the side chapel, hands outstretched, feet testing each step. His fingers found the warm bulk of his horse, traced along to the reins. The animal snorted softly, recognizing him. He was leading both horses toward the door when he saw it, a shape on the floor near the altar, unmoving. Frank Cooper lay on his back, eyes open to ceiling beams he could no longer see. 3 bullet holes in his chest. He'd bought them their escape with his life, and they hadn't even known his first name until now. Jacob stood there for a moment, looking at a young man who had found courage too late to save himself, but just in time to save others. Then he led the horses out into the night. Ayanna saw his face and understood without asking. They mounted in silence and rode north, giving the search parties a wide berth. The storm broke an hour later, rain coming in sheets that turned the world to liquid darkness. Miserable for riding, but it would wash away their tracks and force Morrison's men to give up the search until morning. They rode through the night, following game trails Ayanna knew even in darkness and storm. By dawn they had covered 15 miles and crossed into higher country where the rain had turned to sleet. They stopped in a cave Ayanna led them to, a deep hollow in a cliff face that showed signs of old use, fire rings, marks on the walls. "My people used this place long ago," Ayanna said as they unsaddled the horses. "When traveling these mountains, it is safe." Jacob built a small fire deep in the cave where the smoke would dissipate before reaching the entrance. They stripped off wet clothes and hung them to dry, wrapping themselves in blankets. The warmth felt like mercy after the cold ride. Ayanna was shivering despite the fire. Jacob moved closer, offering his body heat without words. She didn't pull away. They sat side by side, shoulders touching, watching flames dance over wood. "Cooper died for us," Ayanna said after a while. "A man we did not know. He died trying to do right. That counts for something." "Does it?" "He is still dead." Jacob had no good answer for that. He'd seen too many good people die while bad people prospered, but he'd also seen that sometimes one person's courage could tip the balance, could make the difference between justice and injustice. "My father believed that doing right was its own reward," he said slowly, "that you didn't do good because of what you got out of it. You did it because anything else was a betrayal of who you were meant to be." Your father sounds wise. He was. Also poor. Also dead before his time. Jacob stared into the fire. "Sometimes I wonder if wisdom is worth the price. And yet, here you are, doing what your father would do." "Yeah, here I am." Ayanna shifted, turning to look at him directly. In the firelight, her face was all plains and shadows, beautiful in a way that made his chest ache. "I am glad you are here, Jacob McAllister, even if wisdom is expensive, even if this ends badly." "It won't end badly. You cannot know that." "No, but I can believe it. And sometimes belief is all that keeps you moving forward." She studied him for a long moment, then did something that surprised them both. She leaned in and kissed him, soft and brief but unmistakable in its meaning. When she pulled back, her eyes were uncertain. "I am sorry. I should not have—" "Don't be sorry." Jacob's voice was rough. "I'm not." They sat in silence again, but it was different now, charged with possibility, with the recognition that they had become more than allies, that somewhere in the past 2 days of running and fighting and trusting each other with their lives, something had shifted. "When this is over," Ayanna said quietly, "if we survive, what will you do?" "Haven't thought that far ahead." "Think now." Jacob considered. What did he want? He'd spent 5 years drifting, working mines and hunting game, existing but not really living, running from grief and anger with no destination in mind. But now, sitting in this cave with this woman who had somehow become essential to him, he found himself imagining a different future. "I'd like to build something," he said, "not just tear ore out of the ground for someone else's profit. Maybe a cabin, somewhere quiet, somewhere the mountains can speak and people listen." "That sounds good." Ayanna's voice was soft. "My people have land near sacred springs, good land. If we save it from Blackwood, you would be welcome there." "Your people would accept a white man?" "They would accept the man who helped save their home, who risked his life for strangers." She paused. "And I would accept him too." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Jacob reached out and took her hand, her fingers interlaced with his, and they sat like that, connected, while the storm raged outside and the fire burned low. They slept eventually, curled together for warmth, and when Jacob woke a few hours later, he found Ayanna watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "What?" he asked. "You snore." "I do not." "You do, like an angry bear." Despite everything, he smiled. "Well, that's fitting at least." She smiled back, and in that moment, surrounded by danger and uncertainty, Jacob felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the naive kind that believed everything would work out, but the stubborn kind that refused to give up even when the odds were terrible. They broke camp at midday when the storm had passed, leaving the world clean and sharp. The ride to Santa Fe would take another full day, maybe more. And Morrison was still out there somewhere, hunting, but they had the papers, they had each other, and they had a chance. "You ready?" Jacob asked as they mounted. Ayanna looked at him, her face set with determination. "I have been ready since the moment you saved me on that mountain. Now we finish what we started." They rode out into bright afternoon sun, 2 figures against the immensity of the landscape. Behind them, their past. Ahead, their uncertain future. And all around them, the mountains stood witness, ancient and patient, watching as 2 people who had every reason to give up chose instead to fight. The mountain had called Jacob McAllister that morning 3 days ago, had led him to a woman who needed saving and who, in turn, had saved him from a half-life of grief and purposelessness. Together they had become something neither could have been alone, something strong enough to stand against corruption and greed. Whether it would be strong enough to win, only time would tell. But as they descended from the high country toward the valley where Santa Fe waited, Jacob looked over at Ayanna and saw his own determination reflected back at him. They would see this through, whatever it cost. The mountain, watching still, said nothing. But in the way the light fell across the peaks, in the way the wind carried the scent of pine and possibility, it seemed almost as if it approved. Santa Fe rose from the high desert like a promise half kept. Adobe buildings the color of earth, church spires reaching toward cloudless sky, streets that had seen Spanish conquistadors and Mexican traders and now American merchants, all believing they owned what the land would outlast them all. Jacob and Ayanna approached from the northeast as the sun climbed toward noon, their horses tired but steady, their bodies carrying the accumulated exhaustion of 3 days running. But they weren't safe yet, not even close. They stopped on a ridge overlooking the town, and Jacob pulled out the battered telescope he'd carried since his mining days. Through the lens, Santa Fe's plaza came into sharp focus. The palace of the governors, the courthouse, and there, standing outside the marshal's office, a group of men. Too far to identify faces, but the body language was clear, official, waiting. "They know we're coming," Jacob said quietly. Ayanna didn't seem surprised. "Blackwood sent word." "Of course he did. Marshal Cole's office is right there in the middle of everything. We can't just ride up and knock on the door." "Then we find another way." Ayanna studied the town with the tactical eye she'd learned from her warrior husband. "There. Fort Marcy, on the hill north of town. Old army post. If Marshal Cole patrols his territory properly, he will check the fort." Jacob considered this. Fort Marcy had been decommissioned a decade ago but still stood, a useful landmark and occasional shelter for travelers. If they could get word to Cole to meet them there, away from whatever trap Blackwood had set in town proper, they might have a chance. "We need someone to carry a message," Jacob said. "Someone we can trust." Jacob was about to suggest they risk entering town when a figure appeared on the road below. An old Apache man leading a pack mule, moving with the unhurried pace of someone who had walked these trails for more years than most people lived. Jacob tensed, hand moving toward his rifle, but Ayanna grabbed his arm. "Wait, I know him." She stood in her stirrups and called out in Apache. The old man stopped, looked up, and his weathered face split into a smile. He responded in the same language, and Ayanna turned to Jacob with something like relief in her eyes. "John Whitehorse. He knew my father. We can trust him." They descended to meet him, and up close Jacob could see that John Whitehorse was indeed old, perhaps 70, with silver hair in long braids and eyes that carried the weight of a hard century. But those eyes were sharp and clear, and when they assessed Jacob, he felt measured and found acceptable. John spoke, and Ayanna translated. "He says the mountain told him we would come, that we carry something important." "The mountain talks to a lot of people around here," Jacob muttered, but without real skepticism. He'd seen too much in the past days to doubt the mountain's voice. Ayanna and John spoke rapidly in Apache for several minutes. Jacob caught his own name, and Blackwood's, and Morrison's. Finally, Ayanna turned back to him. "John says Marshal Cole is in town but staying at Fort Marcy, not in his office. He does not trust Judge Harrison, who has been acting strangely. Cole knows something is wrong." Jacob felt a surge of hope. "Can John get a message to him?" More Apache conversation, then Ayanna nodded. "He will go. But he says we should wait at the old mission church south of the fort. It is hidden in trees, and no one uses it anymore. He will bring Cole to us there." It was the best plan they had. Jacob pulled out the papers, now creased and stained from their journey, and handed them to John Whitehorse. The old man examined them carefully, then looked at Jacob with new respect. He spoke again, and this time his words needed no translation. The tone said everything. These papers mattered. This fight mattered. John left immediately, his mule plodding steadily toward town, while Jacob and Ayanna circled wide to approach the old mission from the south. It took 2 hours of careful riding through broken country, always staying below ridgelines, always watching their back trail. But they reached the church without incident, a small stone structure so overgrown with vegetation it was nearly invisible until you were upon it. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of old incense and older prayers. They tended to the horses, gave them water from a nearby spring, then settled in to wait. The uncertainty was almost worse than the running had been. At least while moving, they had purpose. Now they could only sit and hope that John Whitehorse reached Cole, that Cole believed them, that the marshal was truly the honest man Jacob remembered. "Tell me about him," Ayanna said, as the afternoon stretched long. "This Marshal Cole, why do you trust him?" Jacob thought back to when he'd met Thomas Cole, 5 years ago when the marshal came to Silver City after his father died. He was investigating the mine. Blackwood had already paid off the local law, had the whole thing ruled an act of God. But Cole kept digging, interviewed every survivor, went down into the shaft himself to look at the conditions that killed my father. Did he find the truth? He found it. But by the time he had enough evidence, Blackwood had sold the mine to a company in Denver and moved on. Cole couldn't touch him. Jacob's jaw tightened. But he tried. That's more than most would do. And he told me something I never forgot. "What?" He said the law was supposed to be a shield for the weak, not a sword for the strong. Said every time it got twisted the other way, it was a lawman's job to straighten it back out, no matter the cost. Jacob met her eyes. Man who says that and means it is worth trusting. Ayanna was quiet for a moment. Then, "I have known few lawmen like that." "There aren't many." The sun was touching the western peaks when they heard hoofbeats, 2 riders approaching at an easy pace. Jacob positioned himself where he could see the entrance while staying hidden, rifle ready. Ayanna took the opposite side, bow drawn. The riders came into view. John Whitehorse on his mule, and beside him a man of perhaps 55, dressed in the practical clothes of someone who worked for a living rather than sat behind a desk. He wore a marshal's star on his vest and carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had faced trouble and come through it. Thomas Cole. Jacob stepped out where he could be seen, and Cole's hand went to his gun before stopping. Recognition flickered across his face. "McAllister? Jacob McAllister from Silver City?" "Yes, sir. Thank you for coming." Cole dismounted, his eyes taking in everything. Jacob's worn condition, the Apache woman emerging from the other side of the church, the tension that spoke of people on the run. "John here tells quite a story. Says you've got proof Vernon Blackwood's been forging land deeds. More than that, Marshal. Proof he's been bribing officials. And there's a body back in Socorro. Deputy Frank Cooper. He was killed helping us escape." Cole's expression hardened. "Cooper's dead? How?" "Shot by Clay Morrison. Cooper had copied Blackwood's documents months ago, hid them in an old church. When Morrison came after us, Cooper helped us escape and paid for it with his life." "Show me the papers." Jacob handed them over, and Cole examined them in the fading light. His face revealed nothing, but Jacob saw his hands tighten on the documents. When he finally looked up, there was cold anger in his eyes. "These are damning. Signatures that don't match official records, dates that don't line up, bribes documented in Blackwood's own handwriting." He looked at Ayanna. "You're Red Sky Walker's granddaughter?" "I am." "Then you should know Judge Harrison issued a warrant for your arrest this morning. Both of you. Murder, kidnapping, theft. Every charge Blackwood could invent to make sure you never got a fair hearing." Jacob felt his stomach drop. "So even with proof, we can't use it?" "I didn't say that. Cole folded the papers carefully and tucked them inside his jacket. Harrison's corrupt, but he's not the only judge in New Mexico territory. The territorial court has jurisdiction over land disputes involving treaties. And Judge Samuel Martinez is presiding this week. He's honest. More than that, he hates Blackwood. Had a cousin who died in one of his mines. Can you get us a hearing in front of Martinez? I can do better than that. I can arrest you. Cole saw their expressions and held up a hand. Hear me out. Harrison's warrant makes you fugitives. But if I bring you in myself, in my custody, I can control where you go and who sees you. I take you straight to territorial court, request an emergency hearing based on evidence of fraud, and put you in front of Martinez before Harrison even knows you're in town. It was risky. They would be giving up their freedom, betting everything on Cole's word and Martinez's integrity. But Jacob looked at Ayanna and saw in her eyes the same calculation he was making. They were out of options. This was their last chance. When? Jacob asked. Now. Tonight. Martinez is still at the courthouse finishing paperwork. If we move fast, we can get this hearing tonight and have a ruling by morning. Cole's voice was urgent. But once we're in town, there's no turning back. You'll be in custody. If this goes wrong, you'll hang. And if we don't try? Ayanna said quietly. My people lose their land. More men like Cooper die. Blackwood wins. Cole looked at her with respect. That's about the size of it, ma'am. Jacob made the decision. We go, now. They rode into Santa Fe as darkness fell, Cole in the lead with Jacob and Ayanna flanking him, their hands unbound but the appearance of custody maintained. John Whitehorse had melted back into the landscape, his part played. Through the plaza they went, past groups of men who watched with hostile eyes, past the sheriff's office where a deputy stepped out, saw Cole's star, and stepped back in. Past the cantinas where music played and people laughed, unaware that justice was being tested just streets away. The territorial courthouse was a two-story adobe building that had seen territorial governors and land disputes since New Mexico was part of Mexico. Lamplight showed in upper windows. Cole dismounted, gestured for them to follow, and led them through a side entrance and up a narrow staircase. Judge Samuel Martinez was in his chambers, a small man with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen enough of human nature to be neither surprised nor impressed by it. He looked up as Cole entered with Jacob and Ayanna. Tom, it's late. I know, Sam. But I need an emergency hearing, land fraud case, treaty violations, and murder. Martinez set down his pen. That's quite a list. The evidence backs it up. Cole placed Frank Cooper's papers on the desk. These were copied by Deputy Frank Cooper of Socorro before Clay Morrison killed him 3 days ago. They show Vernon Blackwood has been systematically forging deeds to Apache land, bribing officials to validate them, and using violence to silence opposition. The judge took the papers, his expression growing darker as he read. When he finished, he looked at Ayanna. You're Apache? I am. Granddaughter of Red Sky Walker. And the land in question is Sacred Springs? Yes, Your Honor. Martinez was quiet for a long moment. Then, I knew your grandfather. He was a good man, honest in his dealings. When he gave his word, it meant something. He looked at Cole. You're asking me to challenge Judge Harrison's authority. He issued the arrest warrant? He did, on Blackwood's word alone. Harrison's compromised, has been for years, but proving it is another matter. Martinez stood, moved to the window, looked out at the dark plaza. If I grant this hearing, Blackwood will know we're coming for him. He'll run or fight. He'll fight, Jacob said. Men like him always do. Martinez turned. And you are? Jacob McAllister, former miner, current witness to corruption. Why does this matter to you, Mr. McAllister? This isn't your land. Jacob thought of his father dying in a hospital bed, of Frank Cooper bleeding out on a church floor, of Ayanna standing against 3 armed men rather than surrender, of all the times he'd seen wrong done and done nothing because it wasn't his fight. Because silence is also a sin, Your Honor. And I'm done being silent." Martinez studied him, then nodded slowly. "All right. I'll convene court at dawn. Full hearing. Blackwood will be summoned to answer charges. And Mr. McAllister, Miss Yazzie, you'll remain in Marshal Cole's custody until then." "Thank you, Your Honor," Cole said. "Don't thank me yet. If we're wrong about this, if those papers don't hold up, we'll all be answering to the territorial governor, and possibly facing charges ourselves. We're not wrong. Then God help Vernon Blackwood, because tomorrow, justice will." Dawn came to Santa Fe with the kind of light that made everything sharp and clear, as if the world itself wanted to bear witness. Jacob stood at the window of the small room where Marshal Cole had kept them overnight, watching the plaza fill with people. Word had spread somehow, the way it always did in towns where everyone knew everyone else's business. The territorial court would hear a case against Vernon Blackwood, and half of Santa Fe wanted to see it. Ayanna stood beside him, her hair freshly braided, wearing the buckskin dress her grandmother had packed for formal occasions. She looked like what she was, Apache royalty preparing for battle, not with weapons, but with truth. Jacob had changed into the only clean shirt he owned, and Cole had even found him water for shaving. If they were going to face Blackwood in court, they would face him with dignity. "Nervous?" Jacob asked quietly. "Terrified." She said it without shame. "My people's future rests on what happens in the next few hours, but I am also ready." "So am I." Cole appeared in the doorway, his face drawn from a sleepless night. "Court convenes in 15 minutes. Judge Martinez has already denied 3 motions from Blackwood's legal team trying to stop this. They claimed Harrison's warrant gave them jurisdiction, but Martinez overruled it. Blackwood's in the building with his lawyer. And there's something else you should know." "What?" "Clay Morrison's here. Showed up an hour ago with 5 men. They're sitting in the gallery armed. Martinez ordered them to remove their guns or leave. They left the guns outside but stayed in the room." Cole's jaw was tight. "It's an intimidation play. They want everyone to remember what happens to people who stand against Blackwood." Jacob felt cold anger settle in his gut. "How many deputies do you have?" "4, and me, against Morrison's 5, plus whatever other supporters Blackwood has in that courtroom." Cole met his eyes. "This could go bad fast, Jacob. If the ruling doesn't go Blackwood's way, Morrison might try something. And if he does, a lot of people could die. Then we make sure the ruling is so clear, so public, that Morrison can't do anything about it without making himself a murderer in front of 50 witnesses. That's what I'm hoping. But hope's not a strategy. It's what we've got." They walked to the courtroom through corridors that smelled of old wood and older justice. People lined the halls, faces Jacob didn't know, whispering as they passed. Some looked sympathetic, others hostile, most just curious, drawn to spectacle the way people always were. The courtroom itself was a high-ceilinged space with wooden benches for observers and a raised platform for the judge. Windows along one wall let in morning light that painted everything gold. The gallery was packed, standing room only, and there, in the front row, sat Vernon Blackwood. Jacob had seen him only once before, 3 years ago at a distance. Up close, Blackwood was smaller than expected. Perhaps 5'8", slender, dressed in an expensive suit that marked him as a man of means. His hair was silver, carefully styled. His face was ordinary, forgettable. The kind of face that could pass through a crowd unnoticed. But his eyes were cold, calculating. The eyes of a man who had learned to see people as obstacles or tools, nothing more. Beside Blackwood sat his lawyer, a heavy-set man in his 40s with the confident bearing of someone who had rarely lost a case. And behind them, scattered through the gallery, Clay Morrison and his men. Morrison's face was bruised, Jacob noticed. Fresh injuries. Had he been in a fight? Or had Blackwood punished him for letting them escape? Marshal Cole led Jacob and Ayanna to a table on the left side of the room. They sat, and Jacob felt the weight of dozens of eyes on them. Judging, wondering. A white man and an Apache woman against one of the territory's most powerful businessmen. It should have been no contest. But they had the papers. They had the truth. And sometimes, in rare moments of grace, truth was enough. Judge Martinez entered, and everyone stood. He took his seat, arranged papers on his desk, and surveyed the courtroom with an expression that gave nothing away. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly through the space. This court is now in session. We are here to address allegations of land fraud, forgery, and conspiracy in the matter of Sacred Springs and surrounding territories currently disputed between the San Carlos Apache people and Blackwood Mining Company. He looked at Blackwood. Mr. Blackwood, you are not under arrest at this time, but you are compelled to answer questions under oath. Do you understand? Blackwood stood, his posture relaxed. I do, Your Honor, though I confess I'm confused why we're here. My company has legal title to the land in question, properly filed and recorded. That title is what we're examining. Martinez gestured to Cole. Marshal, present your evidence. Cole stood and laid out the papers Frank Cooper had copied. One by one, he explained what they showed. Deeds with signatures that didn't match official records. Transfer documents dated after the supposed signers had died. Payments recorded in Blackwood's ledgers to Sheriff Dawson and Judge Harrison. A systematic fraud spanning 3 years. Blackwood's lawyer objected at every turn, claiming the documents were forgeries themselves, that they had been obtained illegally, that hearsay and circumstantial evidence weren't sufficient. But Martinez overruled most objections, his face growing darker as the presentation continued. When Cole finished, Martinez looked at Blackwood. Do you deny making these payments? I deny nothing improper, Your Honor. Business sometimes requires facilitating cooperation between parties. If I made contributions to ensure proper administration of land transfers, that's standard practice. Bribes, Jacob said, his voice cutting through the courtroom murmur. You're calling bribes standard practice. Martinez banged his gavel. Mr. McAllister, you'll have your chance to speak. Mr. Blackwood, are you saying you paid officials to validate land transfers you knew were fraudulent? I'm saying I paid for services rendered. If those services were improperly rendered, that's not my responsibility. It was a neat trap. Blackwood was admitting to the payments while denying knowledge of wrongdoing, setting up the officials he'd bribed as scapegoats. Jacob saw Martinez recognize it too. The judge's expression hardened. Let's try a different approach. Martinez looked at Ayanna. Miss Yazzie, please stand and tell the court about Sacred Springs. Ayanna rose, and the room fell silent. She was the only Apache in the courtroom, Jacob realized. The only one of her people present to defend land they had held for generations. The isolation of it must have been crushing, but she stood straight, her voice steady when she spoke. Sacred Springs has belonged to my people since before there were maps to put it on. 10 generations of Apache have drawn water there, have prayed there, have buried their dead on that land. When the treaties were signed in 1868, that land was recognized as ours in perpetuity. She looked directly at Blackwood. This man wants to tear it apart looking for silver. He does not care that destroying the springs means destroying my people's ability to live on our own land. He does not see us as human beings with rights. He sees obstacles to profit. That's a lie, Blackwood said sharply. I have every respect for the Apache people. But sentiment doesn't change legal ownership. The land was properly purchased from parties with title to sell. From whom? Martinez asked. Who signed the deed? Blackwood's lawyer shuffled papers. Red Sky Walker, the Apache elder, signed over the land in exchange for compensation. That is a lie, Ayanna's voice rang out. My grandmother never signed such a document. She would die first. Yet here is her signature. The lawyer held up a paper. Ayanna looked at it and shook her head. That is not her mark. My grandmother would never sign away Sacred Springs. That signature is false. The lawyer started to respond, but Martinez cut him off. Bring me the original deed. A pause. The lawyer and Blackwood exchanged glances. "Your Honor, the original is filed in Socorro with the Land Office." "Then this hearing is adjourned until that document can be produced and examined by an expert in Apache language and customs." Martinez's voice carried finality. "Furthermore, all mining operations on the disputed land are hereby suspended pending resolution." Blackwood shot to his feet. "Your Honor, that's impossible. We have operations underway, equipment in place, men working. The financial impact should have been considered before you engaged in systematic fraud." Martinez's voice was ice. "This court will reconvene at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Marshal Cole, you will send a rider to Socorro immediately to retrieve the original deed, and Mr. Blackwood, you and your associates will remain in Santa Fe until this matter is resolved. If you attempt to leave, you will be arrested. Am I clear?" "Perfectly clear, Your Honor." Blackwood's voice was smooth, but Jacob saw rage in his eyes. Cold, controlled rage. The judge gavelled the session closed, and the courtroom erupted in conversation. Cole leaned close to Jacob. "That was better than I hoped, but it's not over." "I know. Blackwood won't let this stand. Neither will Morrison." Cole glanced toward the back of the room where Morrison and his men were filing out. "They're going to try something. The question is what and when." Ayanna touched Jacob's arm. "We should return to Fort Marcy. Staying in town is too dangerous." She was right, but Martinez had other ideas. The judge beckoned them to his chambers, and once inside with the door closed, his professional demeanor cracked slightly. "That deed is a forgery," he said without preamble. "I knew it the moment I saw the signature, but I need the original to prove it in a way that will hold up under appeal. Which means someone has to ride to Socorro and back, 8 hours each way if they push it, through country where Blackwood's men are everywhere." "I'll go," Jacob said immediately. "No." Cole shook his head. "You're a witness. We need you here. I'll send my best deputy, Tom Reeves, former Army scout, knows the country." "Send 2, Martinez said. "And give them an escort. This isn't just a legal document anymore. It's evidence in what's shaping up to be a criminal conspiracy case against one of the territory's richest men. If that deed disappears or gets destroyed, we have nothing." Cole nodded and left to make arrangements. Jacob and Ayanna remained in the chambers with Martinez, who poured coffee from a pot on his stove and studied them with frank curiosity. "You two make an unlikely pair," he said. "Mountain man from West Virginia and Apache healer. What brought you together?" "Blackwood," Jacob said simply. "His greed, his willingness to hurt anyone who stood in his way." "And you decided to stand in his way?" "Someone had to." Martinez sipped his coffee. "You know what happens if we win this case? Blackwood loses millions. He doesn't strike me as a man who accepts loss gracefully." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that even if we prove fraud, even if we strip him of the land and fine him into bankruptcy, he's still dangerous. Men like that don't just walk away. They find ways to hurt the people who hurt them." The judge looked at Ayanna. "Your grandmother, your people. They'll need protection." "My people can protect themselves," Ayanna said quietly. "We have been doing it for centuries." "Against other tribes and Mexican soldiers, yes. Against an organized campaign of violence backed by money and corrupt officials?" Martinez shook his head. "That's different. That's what I'm trying to prevent by making this case so public, so airtight, that Blackwood has no choice but to slink away defeated." "Will it work?" Jacob asked. "Ask me tonight after we reconvene." The afternoon crept by with agonizing slowness. Cole had arranged for Jacob and Ayanna to wait in a secure room with 2 deputies standing guard. They tried to rest, but neither could. Too much nervous energy, too much at stake. Around noon, Maria Henderson arrived with food, having traveled from Socorro overnight when she heard about the hearing. She embraced Ayanna like a sister and squeezed Jacob's shoulder with rough affection. "Sam sends his regards," she said. "And this." She pulled out a folded paper, worn soft with age. It's a letter from Red Sky Walker, written 20 years ago and witnessed by the Indian agent at the time. In it, she explicitly states that Sacred Springs can never be sold or transferred, that it is held in trust for future generations. Sam's father witnessed the letter being written. He kept a copy all these years. Jacob took the letter carefully. Does Martinez know about this? He does now. Cole came by my boarding house this morning and I gave him the original. This is my copy. She smiled grimly. Between Frank Cooper's documents and this letter, Blackwood's case is falling apart. Then why don't I feel better? Because the fight's not over, and because you're smart enough to know that desperate men do desperate things. She was right, and her words proved prophetic sooner than anyone expected. At 1:30, 30 minutes before court was set to reconvene, gunshots erupted from the plaza. Jacob was at the window in seconds, looking down to see chaos, men running, women screaming, and in the center of it, Clay Morrison and his crew on horseback, firing into the air, scattering the crowd. "They're clearing the courthouse," Cole said, appearing at the door with his gun drawn, "keeping people away so they can—" He didn't finish because the window behind Jacob exploded inward. Glass shards sprayed across the room. Jacob dove, pulling Ayanna down with him as bullets punched through the walls. The deputies returned fire, and suddenly the quiet afternoon became a war zone. "Back door!" Cole shouted. "Now!" They ran, keeping low, as more shots followed them down the corridor. Behind them, Jacob heard boots thundering upstairs. Morrison's men, coming to finish what they'd started. Cole led them through a service entrance into an alley, but there were more gunmen there. One raised his rifle, aimed at Ayanna. Jacob didn't think. He threw himself in front of her as the rifle cracked. Fire burned across his shoulder, spinning him around. He went down hard, vision graying at the edges. Through the haze he saw Ayanna's face above him, saw her mouth forming his name, saw her pull her bow and send an arrow through the gunman's throat before he could fire again. Then Cole was there, and more deputies, and the gunmen were retreating under return fire. Someone was pressing cloth against Jacob's shoulder, and the pain was bright and terrible. But Ayanna was alive. That was what mattered. "Stay with me," she was saying, her hands on his face. "Jacob, stay with me." "Not planning on leaving," he managed. "Not after all this." "The bullet went through," Cole said, examining the wound. "Clean. You'll live. But we need to get you somewhere safe. The courthouse is compromised. Martinez has already moved to the church. We'll reconvene there." Cole looked at Ayanna. "Can you keep pressure on that wound while we move?" "Yes." They got Jacob to his feet, and the world spun but steadied. His shoulder was a mass of pain, but he'd had worse. Had worked a full shift in a mine with 3 broken ribs once. This was nothing. Just another scar to add to the collection. The church was 2 blocks away, and they made it without further incident. Morrison's attack had been tactical, designed to delay or derail the hearing, but it had failed. The court reconvened in a building dedicated to justice of a higher order, and somehow that felt right. Judge Martinez took one look at Jacob's bloody shirt and almost called things off, but Jacob shook his head. "I'm fine. Let's finish this. Mr. McAllister, you've been shot. And I've been shot before. Your Honor, every minute we wait is another minute Blackwood has to destroy evidence or intimidate witnesses. Frank Cooper died for those papers. I'm not letting his death mean nothing." Martinez studied him, then nodded. "Very well, but sit down before you fall down." The church was smaller than the courthouse, and the gallery was limited to perhaps 30 people who had been brave or foolish enough to follow. But that was enough. Among them, Jacob saw Sam Jenkins and Maria Henderson, saw John Whitehorse, who had somehow materialized from the landscape, saw a dozen faces he didn't know but who had come to bear witness. Blackwood was there too, looking smaller now, diminished. His lawyer was absent, and his confidence had evaporated. Morrison and his men were nowhere to be seen, having fled after their failed attack. It was just Blackwood, alone, facing the consequences of his choices. "Mr. Blackwood," Martinez said, his voice heavy with judgment. Your men just attempted murder in broad daylight in an effort to prevent this hearing. That tells me everything I need to know about the validity of your land claims. But we'll proceed anyway for the record. He held up the deed that deputies had retrieved from Socorro. This document bears what purports to be Red Sky Walker's signature. I have consulted with John Whitehorse, who is fluent in Apache and familiar with Elder Walker's mark. Mr. Whitehorse? The old Apache stood. That is not her signature. It is not even close. Martinez nodded. I've also reviewed this letter, written 20 years ago and properly witnessed, in which Red Sky Walker explicitly states that Sacred Springs cannot be sold or transferred under any circumstances. He looked at Blackwood. You knew this. You forged documents to steal land you had no right to. You bribed officials to validate your fraud. And when people stood in your way, you had them killed. I didn't kill anyone, Blackwood said, but his voice lacked conviction. Clay Morrison works for you, acts on your orders. That makes you complicit. Martinez picked up his gavel. This court finds that all land deeds related to Sacred Springs and associated territories are void due to fraud and forgery. All land is hereby returned to the San Carlos Apache people in accordance with the 1868 treaty. Furthermore, Vernon Blackwood is remanded into Marshal Cole's custody on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and accessory to murder. Bail is denied. The gavel fell like thunder. The spring of 1954 came to New Mexico with unusual gentleness, as if the land itself was healing from the violence of the previous autumn. Jacob stood on the ridge above Sacred Springs, his left shoulder still stiff from the bullet wound but functional, watching the valley below where Ayana's people had gathered for the season's first ceremony. 6 months had passed since Judge Martinez's ruling, 6 months since Vernon Blackwood had been taken away in chains, 6 months since everything changed. The wound in his shoulder was not the only thing that had healed slowly. Trust took time. Acceptance took longer. But standing here now, wearing the shirt that Red Sky Walker had given him with beadwork that marked him as friend to the Apache, Jacob felt something he hadn't felt since his father died. He felt like he belonged somewhere. You are thinking too much again. Ayana's voice came from behind him, warm with affection. I can see it in the way you stand. All serious, like you are carrying the mountain on your back. Jacob turned, and his breath caught the way it still did when he saw her. She wore traditional dress today for the ceremony, her hair adorned with silver and turquoise, but it was her smile that undid him. Open, genuine, the smile of someone who had found peace after long war. Just thinking about how we got here, he said, all the things that had to happen, some of them terrible. Frank Cooper. She said the name softly, with respect. He should be here to see this. Yeah, he should. They stood together in silence, honoring the memory of a young man who had found courage at the worst possible moment and the best possible time. His sacrifice had been recognized officially. Judge Martinez had made sure of that. Cooper's name was now on a memorial in Santa Fe alongside other lawmen who had died in service of justice. His mother had wept when she learned the truth of how her son had died, but there had been pride in those tears too. Marshal Cole sent word yesterday, Ayana said after a while. Clay Morrison was caught in Colorado, trying to cross into Wyoming. He will stand trial in Santa Fe next month. Jacob felt grim satisfaction at the news. Morrison had escaped during the chaos following Blackwood's arrest, had vanished into the territories with a price on his head. But you could only run so long. Justice was slow, but it had a long reach. Will you testify? If needed, though I think they have enough without me. 3 of Morrison's men turned witness against him in exchange for lighter sentences. They told everything. The murders, the intimidation, the attacks. Jacob shook his head. Morrison's going to hang. Good. Ayana's voice carried no mercy, and Jacob didn't blame her. Morrison had terrorized her people, had killed Frank Cooper, had tried to kill them both. Some men earned the rope. Morrison was one of them. Below in the valley, drums began their ancient rhythm, calling the people to gather. It was time for the ceremony, time to officially reconsecrate Sacred Springs now that the threat to it had been removed. Red Skywalker would lead it, her voice still strong despite her 72 years, her authority unquestioned. "We should go down," Ayanna said. "Grandmother asked specifically that you stand beside me during the blessing." "Are you sure that's appropriate? I'm not Apache. You saved our land. You bled for our people. You are as Apache as blood and choice can make you." She took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "Besides, you are mine now. That makes you family whether you like it or not." They descended the ridge together, following paths that Ayanna had walked since childhood, paths that Jacob was learning to know by heart. The valley opened before them, green with spring grass and dotted with wildflowers that painted the ground in purple and gold. The springs themselves emerged from a crack in red stone, clear water bubbling up with a sound like laughter, filling pools that had sustained life here for countless generations. The Apache had gathered in a circle around the largest pool, perhaps 50 people ranging from elders to children too young to understand the significance of what they witnessed. They made space for Ayanna and Jacob, acknowledging them with nods and smiles. Some of the older men still regarded Jacob with wariness, unable to fully trust a white man regardless of what he had done. Jacob understood. Trust was earned slowly among people who had been betrayed too many times. Red Skywalker stood at the water's edge, dressed in ceremonial regalia that spoke of her position and power. She had aged since Jacob first met her 6 months ago, had seemed to diminish once the immediate threat was past, as if holding her people together through crisis had required a strength she could finally let go. But her eyes were still sharp, still saw things others missed. She spoke in Apache, her voice carrying across the gathered people, and Ayanna translated softly for Jacob. Words about continuity, about the responsibility of each generation to the next, about land not as property to be owned, but as trust to be protected, about the courage of those who stand against wrong even when standing seems futile. Then Red Skywalker did something unexpected. She called Jacob forward. He looked at Ayanna, who nodded encouragement and stepped to the elder's side. Up close, he could see how thin she had become, how the skin stretched tight over her bones. She was dying, he realized. Not today, perhaps not this year, but soon. She had held on long enough to see her people safe, and now she was allowing herself to let go. Red Skywalker spoke directly to him in Apache, and Ayanna translated, her voice thick with emotion. "My grandmother says you came to us as a stranger, as one of the people who have taken much from us, but you proved that blood does not determine heart, that courage and honor exist in all peoples who choose them." Red Skywalker reached out and placed her hand on Jacob's wounded shoulder, the touch feather-light but deliberate. "She says you took a bullet meant for her granddaughter, that you watered our land with your blood. This makes you kin. This makes you forever welcome at Sacred Springs." The old woman pulled something from her robe, a necklace, beaded in the traditional way, with a pendant of turquoise carved in the shape of a bear. She placed it around Jacob's neck, her hands trembling slightly with age, and spoke again. "She says this was her husband's," Ayanna translated. "He was called Strong Bear. He died defending this land 40 years ago, before there were papers and courts. He would want you to have this. He would call you brother." Jacob felt his throat close with emotion. He had not cried since his father's funeral, had taught himself not to feel that deeply. But standing here, accepted by these people, honored for simply doing what his father had taught him was right, he felt tears prick his eyes. "Thank you," he said, knowing the words were inadequate but having no better ones. "I will wear it with honor." Red Skywalker smiled, patted his cheek with grandmother affection, then turned back to the ceremony. The drums resumed and the people sang, voices rising in harmonies that predated the country called America, that would outlast it too. Jacob stood beside Ayanna, feeling the weight of the necklace against his chest, feeling accepted in a way he had not been since his parents died. The ceremony lasted until the sun was high, and when it ended, there was food and laughter and stories told in both Apache and English. Children ran between the adults, playing games that had been played here for generations. It was ordinary and profound all at once, the simple fact of life continuing, of people being able to gather on their own land without fear. Sam Jenkins had made the trip from Socorro, his buckboard loaded with supplies he insisted were gifts, not goods for sale. Maria Henderson came too, and the two of them seemed to have developed an understanding in the months since the trial. They sat together on a blanket, Sam's hand occasionally finding Maria's, both of them looking younger than their years. "Never thought I'd see the day," Sam said when Jacob and Ayanna joined them. "Apache and white folk sharing a meal in peace. Feels like something out of a storybook." "It's not peace everywhere," Jacob cautioned. "Just here, just us. The rest of the territory still has plenty of hate to go around." "Maybe so. But every peace has to start somewhere. Why not here? Why not us?" Sam bit into a piece of fry bread, chewed appreciatively. "You two figured out what you're going to do next? Going to stay here?" Jacob looked at Ayanna. They had talked about this, late at night when the fire burned low and the future seemed both possible and terrifying. "We're building a cabin," he said, "on the north edge of the Apache land, where the forest meets the meadow. Red Sky Walker gave us permission." "Gave you an order, more like," Ayanna added with amusement. "She said it was improper for us to continue living separately when everyone knows we are together." Maria laughed. "That woman doesn't miss much." "She sees what needs seeing," Ayanna agreed. "And she is right. It is time." There was a weight to those words, an acknowledgement of the future they were building together. Not White and Apache, but two people who had found each other in the midst of chaos and decided that what they had was worth keeping. It wouldn't be easy. There were still people in Socorro who looked at them with disgust, still Apache who thought Ayanna was betraying her people by loving a white man. But they had faced worse than disapproval. They had faced death and come through it together. "I'm happy for you," Sam said simply. "Both of you. You deserve some peace after what you went through." "Peace." Jacob tested the word. "Still not sure I know what that feels like." "You'll learn." Maria's voice was gentle. "Takes time to stop waiting for the next fight. But eventually you realize the fight's over and life's still there, waiting for you to notice it." She was right, Jacob thought. He was still waiting for the other shoe to drop, for another threat to emerge. But maybe it was time to stop waiting, time to start believing that good things could last. As the afternoon stretched toward evening, people began to drift away to their homes and camps. Red Sky Walker retired to her lodge, exhausted by the ceremony but satisfied. The drums fell silent, and the valley settled into the peaceful sounds of early evening. Birds singing, wind in the grass, water flowing eternally from stone. Jacob and Ayanna walked to the place where their cabin would stand, a level spot with a view of the valley and the mountains beyond. The foundation was already laid, stone on stone, built to last. Timber was stacked and waiting, cut from trees Jacob had felled himself with an axe and determination. In a few months, it would be complete. Their home, a place that belonged to them not by deed or title, but by the sweat they had poured into it. "Tell me something," Ayanna said as they stood looking at the half-built structure. "That day on the mountain when you heard me scream, did you know it would lead to all this?" "No, I just knew someone needed help." "And if you had known about the danger, the running, the fighting, would you still have come?" Jacob thought about Frank Cooper, dead on a church floor, about the bullet that had torn through his shoulder, about all the moments when they could have died or failed or given up. And he thought about standing here now, accepted and at peace, building a future with a woman he loved. "Yeah," he said, "I would have come anyway." "Why?" "Because my father taught me that silence in the face of wrong is also a sin, and because some things are worth the cost." He pulled her close, wrapped his arms around her. You were worth the cost." She leaned into him, and they stood like that as the sun painted the western peaks in shades of copper and gold. In the distance, the sacred springs continued their eternal song, water rising from deep earth, sustaining life, marking this place as special long before humans arrived and long after they would be gone. "I have something to tell you," Ayanna said after a long silence. "What's that?" "I am with child." The words took a moment to register. Then Jacob stepped back, looked at her face, saw truth and joy, and a little fear there. "You're sure?" "I am sure. 2 months now. I did not want to say anything until after the ceremony, until our life was more settled. But grandmother knows. She said the mountain told her." "The mountain talks to everyone but me, apparently." Jacob's voice was rough with emotion. He placed his hand on her stomach, feeling nothing yet but knowing that life was there, growing, a future made flesh. A baby. Our baby. "Are you happy?" "Happy?" He laughed, the sound breaking free. "I'm terrified. I don't know how to be a father. My own father died when I was 23, and I never got to ask him all the things I needed to know." "You will learn. We will learn together." She placed her hand over his. "This child will grow up knowing both worlds, Apache and white. They will be a bridge, the way we are trying to be, and they will know that their parents fought to make a world where such bridges are possible." Jacob thought about that. A child growing up here, learning to track game and read the land from their mother, learning to work stone and wood from their father, learning both languages, both ways of seeing the world. It was a radical idea in 1954 New Mexico, where most people still believed that races should stay separate, where mixed children were looked down on by both sides. But then, everything about their life together was radical. Two people who should have been enemies who became allies and then more, building something new from the ashes of old hatreds. If they could do that, their child could do anything. "We'll need to finish the cabin faster," Jacob said practically. "Before winter, before the baby comes." "The baby will not come until spring. We have time." "Not much. Building takes longer than you think." But he was smiling as he said it, already mentally cataloging what needed to be done. Walls and roof, fireplace and windows, a bed and a cradle. So much work. So much purpose. They sat on the foundation stones as darkness gathered, watching stars emerge one by one. The same stars that had watched over his father in the coal mines of West Virginia before the family moved west, and later in the silver mines of New Mexico where his father took his last breath. The same stars that had watched over Ayanna's ancestors for generations uncounted. The stars cared nothing for human borders or hatreds. They simply shone, constant and eternal, bearing witness to everything below. "Do you think about him?" Ayanna asked. "Frank Cooper?" "Every day. Me too. He gave us this peace, this future. The least we can do is live it well. That's what I'm trying to figure out, what it means to live well." Jacob picked up a stone from the pile, smooth river rock that would become part of their home. "My father worked himself to death for nothing, for wages that kept him barely alive and a company that saw him as replaceable. I swore I wouldn't live like that, but I didn't know what else to do until I met you. And now? Now I know. You live well by building things that last, by protecting what's important, by standing with people even when it's hard." He set the stone carefully in place, the first piece of the next course of wall, by making sure that what you leave behind is better than what you found. Ayanna picked up another stone, placed it next to his. "Then we will build well. For Cooper, for my husband Running Deer, for your father, for all those who died so that we could have this chance." They worked until full dark made it impossible to see, laying stones in the foundation of a home that would shelter not just them, but the future they were creating. And when they finally stopped, exhausted and satisfied, they lay on their backs on the cold stone and looked up at the infinite stars. "The mountain is quiet tonight," Ayanna observed. "Maybe it said all it needs to say. Or maybe it is simply content. It brought us together. It protected us through danger. Now it watches us build, and it is pleased." Jacob smiled at the poetry of it. 6 months ago he would have scoffed at the idea of mountains having opinions about human affairs. But he had learned that there were more ways of understanding the world than the rational and the visible. The Apache knew this, had always known it, and maybe, if he listened carefully enough, he could learn it too. "Tell me about him," he said. "The baby. What do you hope for?" Ayanna was quiet for a long time. "I hope he or she grows up knowing that good people exist in all colors, that courage matters more than blood, that land is not something you own but something you belong to." She turned her head to look at him. "I hope they know their father was a good man who did right even when it cost him everything. Haven't cost me everything, cost me what I didn't need, gave me what I didn't know I wanted." He reached out, found her hand in the darkness. "You, home, purpose, that's not a cost, that's a gift." Far below them, Sacred Springs continued its song, and somewhere in the darkness an owl called, "Hunting." Life continued its cycles, indifferent to human drama, eternal in its patterns. But within those patterns, individuals made choices, stood or fell, loved or hated, built or destroyed. Jacob McAllister, who had come to New Mexico running from grief, had found something worth staying for, had found someone worth building with, and as he lay beside Ayanna under the stars, feeling the weight of the bear necklace against his chest and the promise of future life growing between them, he finally understood what his father had tried to teach him. You made peace with the world not by avoiding conflict, but by facing it honestly, not by accepting injustice, but by standing against it even when you stood alone, not by forgetting the dead, but by honoring them through how you lived. Frank Cooper had died for that principle. Red Skywalker's husband had died for it 40 years earlier. Jacob's father had died for it in a different way, ground down by a system that valued profit over people. Their deaths would mean something only if the living chose to make them mean something. And Jacob chose to build rather than destroy, chose love over hate, chose to believe that two people from different worlds could create a bridge between them, one stone at a time, one choice at a time, one child at a time. The mountain, if it noticed, said nothing. But in the way the wind moved through the valley, in the way the stars shone clear and bright, it seemed almost like a blessing, almost like approval. And in the spring of 1954, in a territory that was still learning what it meant to be part of America, two people who had every reason to be enemies chose instead to be family. The world might not notice, history might not record it, but they would know, and their children would know, and maybe that was enough. The mountain's promise, after all, was not for glory or recognition. It was simply this, that those who listened to its call, who answered when it spoke, who stood for what was right even when standing was hard, would find their way home. Jacob had found his. And it was here, on this foundation of stone, beside this woman, under these eternal stars. Here, where the fighting was done and the building had just begun. Here, where the past could finally rest and the future could finally start. Here, at last, was peace.